The first time Grace Jensen walked into the Mercantile in Palisade, Colorado, the room fell silent as if someone had died right there among the barrels of flour and bolts of calico. It was the spring of 1882, and the thin mountain air seemed to turn even thinner as every eye in the establishment fixed upon her, with expressions ranging from shock to outright disgust. Grace had known it would be this way. She had prepared herself for it during the long stagecoach ride from Denver, steeling her heart against the inevitable rejection that would follow her wherever she went. Her past was not something she could hide in a town this size, not when her reputation had preceded her like a dark cloud rolling across the prairie. She needed thread and needles, nothing more. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the counter where Mrs. Henderson stood, the older woman's face hardening into a mask of righteous indignation the moment Grace drew near. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the creak of floorboards as someone deliberately moved away from her. "I would like to purchase these items, please," Grace said quietly, placing her short list on the counter between them. Her voice barely shook, though her insides felt like they were being torn apart. Mrs. Henderson looked at the paper as if it were contaminated. "We do not serve your kind here." The words struck Grace like a physical blow, though she should have expected them. She had been called worse things than your kind in the past year. Ever since her involvement with Marcus Whitley had become public knowledge, ever since the scandal had erupted and destroyed what little standing she had in society, Grace had learned that forgiveness was a commodity reserved for those whose sins were considered forgivable. Being the mistress of a married man, even unknowingly, was apparently beyond redemption. "I can pay," Grace said, her voice firmer now. She had little money, but she had enough for thread. "Your money is no good here. Please leave before you drive away my respectable customers." Grace felt the heat rising in her cheeks, the humiliation burning through her like wildfire. She had known this town might be difficult, but she had hoped that perhaps, just perhaps, being far enough from Denver would grant her some measure of anonymity. Clearly, she had been foolish to hope for such mercy. She turned to leave, her vision blurring with unshed tears that she refused to let fall in front of these people. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But as she reached the door, it swung open, and a man stepped inside, nearly colliding with her in the doorway. "Pardon me, miss," he said, tipping his hat. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of warm honey. His face was weathered from sun and wind, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his place in the world and was comfortable in it. Grace mumbled something incoherent and tried to move past him, but the man's attention had already shifted to the scene behind her, taking in Mrs. Henderson's stern expression and the hostile faces of the other customers. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of concern. "Nothing that concerns you, Yates," Mrs. Henderson said sharply. "Just asking this woman to leave." The man, Yates apparently, looked back at Grace with those honey-colored eyes, and she saw something in them that she had not seen in a very long time. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just basic human kindness. Whatever it was, it made her heart skip in an unexpected way. "She caused some kind of trouble?" Yates asked. "Her very presence is trouble," Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "This is Grace Jensen, recently arrived from Denver. Perhaps you have heard the stories." Grace watched as recognition dawned on the man's face, but surprisingly, his expression did not change to one of disgust or judgment. Instead, he simply nodded slowly and said, "I do not put much stock in stories, madam. I prefer to judge people by what I see with my own eyes." "Then you are a fool, Yates Donovan," Mrs. Henderson declared. That woman was the mistress of a married man, carrying on in sin for months before his poor wife discovered them. She has no morals, no decency, no shame. Grace wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had not known Marcus was married, that he had lied to her about everything, that she had been as devastated as his wife when the truth came out. But she had learned that explanations fell on deaf ears. People believed what they wanted to believe, and the story of the wicked other woman was far more satisfying than the truth of a naive young woman deceived by a practiced liar. "That's so," Yates said, still looking at Grace. "Well, I reckon we have all done things we are not proud of." "I know I sure have." He stepped aside, gesturing for Grace to precede him out the door. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of his intentions, but the alternative was to remain in the mercantile being stared at like some kind of exotic and repulsive creature. She walked outside into the bright spring sunshine, blinking against the sudden glare. Yates followed her out, letting the door swing shut behind him. The street was busy with the usual traffic of a mining town, wagons rolling past, horses tied to hitching posts, men in dusty work clothes heading to or from the saloons and businesses that lined the main thoroughfare. "I apologize for that," Yates said. "Mrs. Henderson can be a hard woman when she sets her mind to it. She is only saying what everyone thinks," Grace replied, surprised to find her voice steady. "I am accustomed to it by now. That does not make it right." Yates shifted his weight, his spurs jingling softly with the movement. "What did you need from the mercantile? It does not matter. I will find another way. There is a smaller shop on the south end of town. The owner is a man named Chen. He is from China originally, came here during the railroad construction. He does not concern himself much with gossip, seeing as how he has been on the receiving end of enough of it himself." Grace looked up at this stranger, who was showing her more kindness in 5 minutes than she had received from anyone in months. "Why are you helping me?" Yates smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and surprisingly gentle. "Because you look like you could use a friend, and I know what it is like to be judged for things that are not entirely your fault." Before Grace could respond, Yates tipped his hat again and walked past her into the mercantile, leaving her standing on the wooden sidewalk feeling more confused than ever. She had expected many things when she arrived in Palisade, but kindness from a stranger had not been among them. She found the shop Yates had mentioned, a narrow building wedged between a boarding house and a saddle maker. The proprietor, Mr. Chen, greeted her with polite neutrality and sold her the thread and needles she needed without comment or judgment. It was such a relief that Grace felt tears prickling at her eyes again as she left, clutching her small parcel like it was precious treasure. The boarding house where she had taken a room was run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan, a thin woman with iron-gray hair and a perpetually disapproving expression. She had only agreed to rent Grace a room because business was slow, and she had made it clear that any trouble would result in immediate eviction. Grace climbed the narrow stairs to her small room on the second floor, barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, and sat down on the thin mattress. This was her life now. This tiny room, the hostile stares, the constant weight of shame that followed her everywhere. She had come to Palisade hoping to start over, to find work as a seamstress and build a quiet, anonymous existence where her past would not matter. But clearly, that had been a foolish dream. Somehow, the story had followed her, probably courtesy of someone from Denver who had family or business connections in this mining town. Grace pulled out her sewing and tried to focus on the simple task of mending a torn petticoat, but her mind kept returning to the man in the mercantile. Yates Donovan. The name suited him somehow, strong and straightforward. She wondered what he had meant about being judged for things not entirely his fault. Everyone had a story, she supposed, though most people's stories did not result in them being treated like a leper. The next few days passed in a blur of loneliness and rejection. Grace put up notices offering sewing services, but no one responded. She tried visiting other shops in town, but word of her identity had spread quickly, and she was turned away more often than not. The few people who would sell to her did so with obvious reluctance, handling her money as if it might contaminate them. On Sunday, Grace made the mistake of attempting to attend church. She dressed in her most modest gown, pinned her dark blonde hair into a severe bun, and walked the 3 blocks to the white-painted church on the edge of town. But when she tried to enter, she was stopped at the door by the minister himself, a portly man with a red face and eyes like chips of ice. "I am sorry, Miss Jensen, but I cannot allow you to attend services here. Your presence would be offensive to my congregation." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "I came to worship. I came to pray." "Then pray in your room. God hears prayers wherever they are offered." "But I will not have a woman of loose morals sitting among decent, God-fearing people." The minister's wife stood just behind him, nodding in agreement, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Grace wanted to scream at them, to point out the hypocrisy of turning away someone seeking redemption in the very place that should offer it. But she had learned that arguing only made things worse. She turned and walked away, her eyes burning with angry tears. She had made it perhaps half a block when she heard hoofbeats behind her, and then a familiar voice calling out, "Miss Jensen, you all right?" She turned to see Yates Donovan riding toward her on a handsome bay horse. He reined in beside her, his expression concerned as he took in her obvious distress. "I am fine," she lied. Yates dismounted in one smooth motion. "You do not look fine. What happened?" "Nothing that has not happened before. The minister informed me that my presence in church would offend his congregation." Yates's jaw tightened. "Reverend Thompson is a sanctimonious fool. He spends more time judging others than tending to his own soul. Perhaps he is right to keep me away. Perhaps my presence would upset people. Or perhaps people need to be upset sometimes." Yates looked at her with those warm eyes, and Grace felt something shift inside her chest. "Would you like to take a walk? I know a place where the creek runs clear and the cottonwoods are starting to leaf out. It is peaceful there." Grace knew she should say no. She barely knew this man, and her reputation was already in tatters. Being seen walking alone with a man would only make things worse. But the alternative was returning to her lonely room, and she found she could not bear that thought. "I would like that," she said quietly. Yates led his horse by the reins as they walked together through the outskirts of town and down a narrow path that wound between rocky outcroppings and sparse pines. The elevation here was high enough that snow still lingered in the shadowed places, but the sun was warm on Grace's face, and the air smelled clean and fresh in a way that the city never had. They reached the creek, which ran fast and cold with snowmelt from the higher peaks. The cottonwoods Yates had mentioned were indeed just beginning to show the green of new growth, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful and peaceful, and Grace felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "How did you find this place?" she asked. "I work for a ranch about 5 miles west of here, the Rocking D. I ride into town once or twice a week for supplies or just to remind myself what civilization looks like. I come here sometimes when I need to think." "What do you think about?" Yates smiled slightly. "All sorts of things. The future mostly, where I am headed, what I want to do with my life." He paused, then added, "The past sometimes, though I try not to dwell on it too much." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the rush of the water and the call of birds in the trees. Grace found herself relaxing in a way she had not in months, the simple pleasure of being in the presence of someone who did not look at her with disgust or judgment. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course. Why are you being kind to me? You must have heard the stories. You know what people say about me." Yates picked up a smooth stone from the creek bank and turned it over in his hands. "I heard the stories, but stories are not always the whole truth. And even if they were, even if everything people say about you is accurate, I still do not think it gives them the right to treat you the way they have been." "I was involved with a married man," Grace said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "That much is true. But I did not know he was married. He told me his name was Marcus White, that he was a businessman from Chicago, that he was in Denver temporarily to oversee some investments. We courted for 3 months before he asked me to marry him. I said yes. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive." She laughed bitterly at the memory of her own naivete. Then his wife showed up. Her name was Catherine Whitley. She came to my boarding house with a lawyer and 2 witnesses, and she told me exactly who Marcus really was. A married man with 3 children, a successful merchant who made regular trips to Denver to conduct business, and apparently to conduct affairs with foolish young women who should have known better. Yates had gone very still, listening intently. Grace continued, the words pouring out now like water from a broken dam. "Catherine Whitley made sure everyone in Denver knew what had happened. She had every right to be angry, and I do not blame her for that. But the scandal destroyed me. I lost my position as a teacher at the girls' school. My landlady evicted me. People I had known for years crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. Marcus returned to Chicago with his wife, and I was left to deal with the aftermath alone." "That is not your fault," Yates said firmly. "You were deceived. Try telling that to anyone else in this town. To them, I am a scarlet woman, a home wrecker, a woman of loose morals who got what she deserved. Then they are wrong." The simple conviction in his voice made Grace's throat tighten with emotion. "You do not even know me. I know enough. I know that you came to church this morning seeking solace and were turned away. I know that you carry yourself with dignity even when people treat you shamefully. I know that you have been hurt badly, but you are still trying to build a life for yourself instead of giving up." Grace found herself blinking back tears. "Why do you care?" Yates tossed the stone into the creek, watching the splash it made. "My father was a good man who made one mistake. He got into debt trying to keep our farm going during a drought year, and when he could not pay, he tried to rob a stagecoach to get the money. He got caught and was hanged for it when I was 16 years old." Grace gasped softly, but Yates continued, his voice steady but tinged with old pain. "After that, people looked at me like I was tainted somehow, like my father's crime made me less than human. I lost friends. Girls I had known all my life suddenly would not speak to me. The town where I grew up made it clear I was not welcome anymore. So I left and came west, looking for a place where I could be judged on my own merits instead of my father's mistakes." "I am sorry," Grace said softly. "That must have been terrible." "It was, but it taught me something important. It taught me that people are quick to judge and slow to forgive. And that sometimes the most important thing you can do is show someone a little kindness when the whole world is being cruel to them." They stood together by the creek, 2 people marked by scandal and loss, and Grace felt something stirring in her heart that she had thought was dead. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of connection with another human being who understood what it meant to be cast out and condemned. "Thank you," she said, "for this, for listening, for not judging me. You are welcome." And Grace, if I may call you that, I want you to know that you have a friend in this town, at least one person who sees you as a person, not a story." Grace smiled, a real smile, possibly the first genuine one she had worn in months. "You may call me Grace, and I would be honored to call you my friend, Yates." They walked back to town together as the afternoon sun began to slant toward the western peaks. Yates left her a respectable distance from the boarding house, not wanting to cause her any more trouble than she already had. But as Grace climbed the stairs to her room, she felt lighter somehow, as if the burden she had been carrying had lessened just slightly. Over the following weeks, Grace and Yates began to meet regularly, always away from the prying eyes of the town. Sometimes they walked by the creek. Sometimes they rode out to a meadow where wildflowers were beginning to bloom in riotous profusion. Yates taught her about the land, pointing out the different types of sage and explaining how to read the weather by watching the clouds that built up over the mountains each afternoon. Grace found herself talking to him about things she had never shared with anyone. Her childhood in a small Iowa town, her mother's death when she was 12, her father's subsequent remarriage to a woman who had little patience for a grieving stepdaughter. She told him about her decision to become a teacher, her move to Denver at 19, her initial loneliness in the big city, and then her growing confidence as she built a life for herself. And she told him about Marcus, about the way he had swept into her life with his charm and his promises, about how desperately she had wanted to believe that someone could love her the way he claimed to. About the shattering moment when Catherine Whitley had appeared and destroyed every dream Grace had been building. Yates listened to all of it without judgment, sometimes offering insights or observations, sometimes just being present with her in her pain. And in turn, he shared more of his own story. The good years on the farm before the drought, his mother's death from fever the same year his father was hanged, his years of drifting from job to job before finally landing at the Rocking D Ranch where he had worked for the past 3 years. "The owner, Mr. Daniels, he is a fair man," Yates told her one afternoon as they sat in the shade of a large boulder, watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. "He does not care about where you came from or what mistakes you might have made. He cares about whether you can do the work and whether you are honest. I wish more people were like him. He sounds like a good man to work for." "He is. He has offered to make me foreman when the current one retires next year. It would mean better pay, more responsibility. A chance to really build something." Grace heard the excitement in his voice and smiled. "You should do it. You would be wonderful at that." Yates looked at her, his expression suddenly serious. "I have been thinking about the future a lot lately, about what I want, where I want to be, who I want to be with." Grace's heart began to beat faster. Over the weeks of their friendship, she had felt her feelings for Yates deepening into something more than simple gratitude or companionship. But she had been afraid to acknowledge it, afraid that she was reading too much into his kindness, afraid that her damaged reputation would make any real relationship impossible. "Grace," Yates continued, reaching out to take her hand. The touch sent warmth flooding through her. "I know we have not known each other long. I know that you came here to start over, to build a new life, but I want you to know that I care about you, a great deal, more than I probably should given the circumstances." "Yates," Grace whispered, but he shook his head gently. "Let me finish. I do not care what happened in Denver. I do not care what people in this town say about you. I know who you are. I have seen your kindness, your strength, your courage. I have watched you hold your head high even when people treat you terribly. I have listened to your dreams and your fears, and I want to be part of your future if you will let me." Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but these were not tears of pain or humiliation. These were tears of joy and relief and a happiness so profound It almost frightened her. "I care about you too," she said, her voice shaking. "More than I thought I could care about anyone again after Marcus. But Yates, I am afraid. Afraid that my past will hurt you, that people will judge you for being associated with me, that I will bring you nothing but trouble." "Then let them judge. I am not afraid of what people think. I am only afraid of losing you before I even have a chance to show you how much you mean to me." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Grace did not want to. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. It was nothing like the passionate but ultimately hollow kisses Marcus had given her. This kiss felt real and honest and right in a way that made her heart soar. When they finally pulled apart, Grace was smiling through her tears. "What do we do now? Now we take things one day at a time. I will court you properly the way you deserve to be courted. And eventually, when the time is right, I am going to ask you to marry me, if that is something you would want." "It is," Grace said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It is exactly what I want." But their happiness was not to go unchallenged. As their relationship became known in town, the hostility toward Grace intensified. People who had merely avoided her before now made a point of openly criticizing her, sometimes within her hearing. Mrs. Henderson spread rumors that Grace was trying to trap Yates into marriage, that she was using her wiles to ensnare an innocent man, just as she had done with Marcus Whitley. Yates confronted Mrs. Henderson directly one afternoon, when he overheard her making such comments in the Mercantile. "You will stop spreading lies about Grace, or you will lose my business and the business of every man at the Rocking D. I will make sure of that." Mrs. Henderson sputtered in outrage. "How dare you defend that woman? She is a homewrecker, a scarlet woman, a blight on this town." "She is a good person who made no mistake except trusting a liar," Yates said firmly. "And if you or anyone else continues to treat her this way, you will answer to me." Word of the confrontation spread quickly, and opinion in town became divided. Some people respected Yates for standing up for Grace, seeing it as a sign of character and loyalty. Others viewed it as confirmation that Grace had worked her wicked charms on yet another unsuspecting man. The situation came to a head one evening when Grace and Yates were leaving Chen's shop after purchasing some fabric for a dress Grace was making. A group of women, led by Mrs. Henderson and the minister's wife, had apparently been waiting for them. "Shame on you, Yates Donovan," Mrs. Thompson declared, her voice ringing out across the street. "Shame on you for consorting with a woman of ill repute. You are destroying your good name for a Jezebel who cares nothing for morality or decency." Grace felt Yates tense beside her, but before he could respond, she stepped forward. She was tired of being silent, tired of accepting the judgment and condemnation without defending herself. "You do not know me," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "None of you know me. You know a story, a version of events that suits your need to feel superior and righteous. You know nothing of what I suffered, of the lies I was told, of the betrayal I experienced. You call me a homewrecker, but I was as much a victim of Marcus Whitley's deception as his wife was." "A likely story," Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "What woman does not know when a man is married?" "A woman who is lied to by an expert liar," Grace shot back. "A woman who is young and naive and wants desperately to believe that she is loved. I was wrong to trust him so completely. I should have asked more questions, should have been more cautious. I have paid for that mistake every day since. But I will not stand here and let you condemn me for being deceived, for being human, for making an error in judgment." The women exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response. Grace pressed on, the words flowing now like a river breaking through a dam. "You stand there in your righteousness, secure in your marriages and your social standing, and you judge me for falling victim to a man's lies. But not one of you has offered me compassion or understanding. Not one of you has asked to hear my side of the story. You have simply decided that I am guilty and condemned me accordingly. We are trying to protect this town from the influence of women like you, Mrs. Thompson said stiffly. Women like me. You mean women who have suffered. Women who have been hurt and betrayed and are trying to rebuild their lives. What kind of Christianity is it that turns away the wounded and casts stones at the fallen? That struck a chord, and Grace saw several of the women shift uncomfortably. But Mrs. Henderson was not ready to back down. You are trying to trap Mr. Donovan into marriage, just as you tried to trap Mr. Whitley. I am not trying to trap anyone, Grace said wearily. Yates knows my history. He knows everything about my past, and he has chosen to see me as a person rather than a scandal. That is his choice to make, not yours. Yates stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Grace's shoulder. She is right. This is between Grace and me, and it is none of your concern. I am courting her because I admire her, because I care about her, because she is one of the strongest and most courageous women I have ever met. If that offends you, then I suggest you look to your own hearts and ask yourselves why the idea of forgiveness and redemption troubles you so much. With that, he guided Grace away from the group, leaving the women standing in a shocked cluster on the sidewalk. Grace was shaking by the time they reached the boarding house, adrenaline and emotion flooding through her system. You were magnificent, Yates said, taking both her hands in his. I have never seen anything like that. I should not have lost my temper. You did not lose your temper. You stood up for yourself with dignity and honesty. I am proud of you. Grace leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. This is never going to get easier, is it? They are never going to forgive me. Some of them will in time, others never will. But Grace, their forgiveness is not required for you to live a good life. We do not need their approval to be happy. That night, Grace lay in bed thinking about everything that had happened. She had been so afraid for so long, so consumed by shame and the weight of other people's judgment. But standing up to those women had felt liberating, like she was finally taking control of her own story instead of letting others write it for her. The next morning, she woke to find a note that had been slipped under her door. It was from a woman named Sarah Mitchell, someone Grace had seen around town but never spoken to. The note was brief but powerful. Dear Miss Jensen, I heard about what happened yesterday. I want you to know that I do not judge you. I too was deceived by a man years ago before I married my husband. I understand what it is like to be blamed for someone else's sins. If you ever need a friend, please do not hesitate to call on me. Grace clutched the note to her chest, feeling hope bloom in her heart. Perhaps not everyone in Palisade was determined to condemn her. Perhaps there were others who understood, who might be willing to see past the scandal to the person underneath. Over the following weeks, Grace discovered that her public confrontation with Mrs. Henderson and the other women had shifted something in the town's perception of her. Several people, including Sarah Mitchell and her husband, began to acknowledge Grace when they saw her on the street. Mr. Chen told her that some of his other customers had been asking about her sewing services. Grace threw herself into her work, taking on mending and alterations, then gradually moving into making complete garments for the few people willing to hire her. Her reputation as a skilled seamstress began to spread, and even some of the women who had previously shunned her found themselves reluctantly seeking her services when they needed a particularly difficult job done. She and Yates continued to court, though they were careful to maintain propriety. He would call on her at the boarding house, sitting in the narrow parlor under Mrs. Callahan's watchful eye, or they would attend community events together, enduring the stares and whispers with heads held high. In the summer of 1882, 5 months after Grace had first arrived in Palisade, Yates took her to meet Mr. Daniels at the Rocking D Ranch. The ranch was beautiful, sprawling across a valley with mountains rising on all sides. Cattle dotted the grasslands, and the ranch house itself was a large, sturdy structure built of logs and stone. Mr. Daniels turned out to be a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. His wife, Margaret, was a plump woman with graying hair and a warm smile that reminded Grace of her own mother. "So you are the young lady we have been hearing so much about," Margaret said, ushering Grace into the kitchen. "Yates talks about you constantly. It is Grace this and Grace that until my husband threatens to stuff a sock in his mouth." Grace laughed, feeling herself relax in the presence of this kind woman. "I hope he has not been too much of a nuisance." "Not at all. It is good to see him happy. He has been alone for too long, carrying too much weight on his shoulders." Margaret poured coffee and set out fresh bread and butter. "I understand you have had some difficulties in town." Grace tensed, wondering how much Yates had told them. "Some, yes." "Well, you should know that we do not hold with gossip or judging people based on their past. What matters to us is character, and Yates is an excellent judge of character. If he sees something worthy in you, then that is good enough for us." The acceptance in Margaret's voice brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Thank you. You have no idea how much that means to me." They spent the afternoon at the ranch, with Yates showing Grace around the property and introducing her to the other ranch hands. Most of them were friendly, curious about the woman who had captured their colleague's heart. A few were more reserved, clearly aware of the gossip from town, but none were outwardly hostile. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Yates took Grace to a rise overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking, the land rolling out before them in waves of grass and stone, the mountains standing guard in the distance. "I want to build a house here someday," Yates said quietly. "When I become foreman, Mr. Daniels has agreed to give me a piece of land to build on. I have been saving my wages for years now. I almost have enough to start construction." Grace's heart began to race. "That sounds wonderful." Yates turned to her, taking her hands in his. "I want to build it for us, Grace, for our future together. I know we have only known each other for a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your courage. I love the way you stand up for yourself even when the whole world seems against you. I love the way you see the good in people despite all the cruelty you have endured." "Yates," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's wedding ring. It is not fancy, but it is the most precious thing I own. Grace Jensen, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in this valley and let me spend every day showing you how much you are loved?" Grace could barely speak through her tears. "Yes. Yes, Yates, I will marry you. I love you so much." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her as the sun set behind them, painting the world in gold and crimson light. The engagement announcement caused another stir in Palisade. Mrs. Henderson declared it a travesty, predicting that the marriage would end in disaster. The minister's wife organized a petition to have Grace banned from all community events. But there were also voices of support, more than Grace had expected. Sarah Mitchell and her husband hosted a small engagement party, inviting several other couples who were willing to overlook Grace's past and celebrate her future. The wedding was planned for late September, after the summer heat had broken but before the winter snows began. Grace spent her days sewing her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of cream-colored silk that she had purchased from Mr. Chen with her sewing earnings. Yates worked on preparing for his new role as foreman, which he would officially assume in October, and making plans for the house he would build. As the wedding day approached, Grace found herself growing nervous. Not about marrying Yates, of that she was absolutely certain, but about the ceremony itself, about standing up in front of the town and declaring her love for him, about facing down the judgment and disapproval that was sure to be present. Reverend Thompson had refused to perform the ceremony, no surprise to anyone. Instead, they had arranged for a traveling preacher who was passing through Palisade to officiate. The man, Reverend Walsh, was an elderly circuit rider who had spent his life ministering to remote communities and had little patience for social prejudices. "God's grace is for everyone," he told Grace and Yates when they met with him to discuss the ceremony. "I have married outlaws who found redemption, former slaves building new lives, and more couples with complicated histories than I can count. Your story is no more shocking than 100 others I have heard, and it is considerably more innocent than many. I would be honored to join you in marriage." The wedding took place on a bright September afternoon in the yard behind the Daniels' ranch house. Margaret Daniels had insisted on hosting, saying that the celebration should take place somewhere Grace would feel welcome and loved. Tables had been set up under the cottonwood trees, laden with food prepared by Margaret and several of the ranch wives. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing a simple arch decorated with late summer wildflowers. Grace stood in the ranch house, looking at herself in the mirror. Sarah Mitchell was with her, having volunteered to serve as her attendant. The cream silk dress fit perfectly, accentuating her slender figure and bringing out the gold in her hair. She wore no jewelry except for Yates's mother's ring, which she had not removed from her finger since the day he proposed. "You look beautiful," Sarah said warmly. "Yates is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Grace replied. "A year ago I thought my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days alone, marked by scandal and shame. But Yates saw past all of that. He saw me. He is a good man. You both deserve this happiness." The ceremony was small, attended by the Daniels family, the ranch hands and their families, Sarah and her husband, Mr. Chen, and a few other people from town who had decided to support the union despite the gossip. Mrs. Henderson and her cohort were notably absent, but Grace found she did not care. The people who mattered were there, the people who had shown her kindness and acceptance. As Grace walked across the grass toward the arch where Yates waited, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. He looked handsome in his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his honey-colored eyes shining with love as he watched her approach. When she reached him, he took her hand and squeezed it gently. Reverend Walsh performed a simple but moving ceremony, speaking of love and forgiveness, of new beginnings and the grace that allows people to move past their mistakes and build something beautiful. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed Grace with such tenderness that she felt her heart might burst with joy. The celebration that followed was lively and warm. The ranch hands played fiddles and guitars, and there was dancing on the grass as the sun set behind the mountains. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in years, swept up in the joy of the moment and the love of the people around her. As night fell and stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky, Yates and Grace slipped away from the party. They rode together on his horse to the site where their house would be built, the foundation already laid and the first logs cut and waiting. "By next summer we will be living here," Yates said, helping Grace down from the horse. "Our own home, our own land, a fresh start for both of us." Grace looked up at the stars, so bright and numerous in the clear mountain air. I never thought I could be this happy again. After everything that happened, I thought happiness was something that was no longer available to me." "You deserve every bit of happiness in the world," Yates said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." They stood together in the darkness, two people who had been broken by life and had found healing in each other. The past could not be changed, but the future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. The first year of their marriage was busy and productive. Grace continued her sewing business, which had grown substantially as more people came to appreciate her skill and were willing to overlook her history. Yates thrived in his new role as foreman, earning respect from the ranch hands and praise from Mr. Daniels for his leadership and work ethic. Construction on their house progressed through the fall and into the winter, with work pausing during the heaviest snow months and resuming in early spring. By the summer of 1883, the house was complete, a beautiful two-story structure with wide windows that looked out over the valley and a porch that wrapped around three sides. Grace furnished it with pieces she and Yates had collected, some purchased from the mercantile in Palisade, despite Mrs. Henderson's disapproval, others made by Yates himself in the ranch workshop during the long winter evenings. She sewed curtains and quilts, creating a home that was warm and welcoming. In October of 1883, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with both joy and terror. She was 24 years old, and this would be her first child. Yates was overjoyed, immediately becoming protective and insisting that she not overwork herself. "I am pregnant, not dying," Grace told him with exasperated affection when he tried to prevent her from lifting a basket of laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." But she was touched by his concern, by the way he would rest his hand on her growing belly and talk to the baby about the life they would have together on the ranch. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly secure, truly loved, truly worthy. The pregnancy progressed normally through the winter, though Grace found the last months difficult as her belly grew large and movement became awkward. Margaret Daniels became a constant presence, offering advice and support, sharing stories of her own pregnancies decades earlier. In May of 1884, on a warm spring evening, Grace went into labor. Yates rode frantically to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. O'Brien, who had delivered half the babies in the county. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally, as the sun reached its zenith, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Yates held his son with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect. Grace, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, after Yates's father, and Daniel, after Mr. Daniels, who had given Yates a chance when others might not have. Thomas Daniel Donovan came into the world with a loud cry and a full head of dark hair. And from the moment Grace held him, she knew that her life had truly begun anew. The months following Thomas's birth were exhausting but joyful. Grace discovered that motherhood suited her, though the sleepless nights and constant demands were challenging. Yates was a devoted father, coming in from the ranch during the day to check on his wife and son, spending his evenings rocking Thomas to sleep while singing old songs his mother had taught him. As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, the Donovan family became an established part of the ranch community. People who had once shunned Grace now greeted her warmly when she came to town with Thomas. Even Mrs. Henderson had softened somewhat, though she still maintained a cool distance. The change was most evident one Sunday morning in the summer of 1885, when Grace, carrying 2-year-old Thomas, walked into the church for the first time since she had been turned away 3 years earlier. The congregation fell silent, all eyes turning to watch as she made her way down the aisle. Reverend Thompson was no longer the minister, having moved to a larger church in Denver. The new pastor, Reverend Clark, was a younger man with a more compassionate approach to his ministry. He smiled warmly at Grace and gestured for her to take a seat. As the service began, Grace felt Yates reach over and squeeze her hand. She looked around at the faces in the congregation, some welcoming, some neutral, a few still disapproving. But it did not matter anymore. She had built a life here, a good life, despite all the obstacles. She had a husband who loved her, a beautiful son, a home, and a place in the community that she had earned through her own character and perseverance. The years passed peacefully. In 1887, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine Margaret, after Yates's mother and Margaret Daniels. Little Catherine was a bright, energetic child who kept her parents constantly entertained with her curiosity and mischief. In 1889, when Thomas was 5 and Catherine 2, Mr. Daniels announced his retirement and sold the Rocking D Ranch to Yates and 2 other longtime employees who pooled their resources to purchase it. Yates became the primary manager, a role he had essentially been fulfilling for years, but now had the official authority and ownership stake to match. The ranch prospered under their management. They expanded the herd, improved the grazing land, and built a reputation for quality cattle that brought buyers from as far as Denver and beyond. Grace's sewing business had evolved into a small dress shop in Palisade, run from a storefront that Yates helped her purchase. She employed 2 other women, providing them with steady income and training in the trade. One autumn day in 1891, as Grace was working in her shop, the bell above the door chimed and a well-dressed woman entered. Grace looked up from the dress she was hemming and felt her heart stop. It was Catherine Whitley, the woman whose husband had deceived them both all those years ago in Denver. Catherine looked older, her face lined with care, but she was still handsome in a severe sort of way. She stood just inside the door, looking at Grace with an unreadable expression. "Mrs. Whitley," Grace said quietly, setting down her sewing with trembling hands. "This is unexpected." "I am sure it is. May I speak with you for a moment?" In private, Grace's assistant, a young woman named Emma, looked between them with wide eyes. Grace nodded to her. "Emma, why do not you take your lunch break now?" Once they were alone, an awkward silence filled the shop. Finally, Catherine spoke. "I came to Palisade to visit my sister. She moved here 2 years ago. When I mentioned your name, she told me that you live here, that you are married and have children." "Yes," Grace said. "I married in 1882. We have 2 children, a son and a daughter." Catherine nodded slowly. "I came here to tell you something. I should have told you years ago, but I was too angry, too hurt, too focused on making someone pay for what happened. My husband, Marcus, he deceived you just as he deceived me and half a dozen other women over the years. I learned after the scandal in Denver that you were not the first and certainly not the last. He is incapable of fidelity, incapable of honesty." Grace felt old pain stirring but pushed it away. "I know he lied to me. I have made peace with that." "I blamed you," Catherine continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I made you the villain of the story because it was easier than admitting that my husband was a monster. I destroyed your reputation in Denver, made sure everyone knew what had happened, but I never told them the full truth. I never told them that you were an innocent victim of his manipulations. Mrs. Whitley, please let me finish. I divorced Marcus 5 years ago. My children are grown now, and I finally had the strength to leave him. In the process of untangling our lives, I discovered evidence of at least 10 other affairs, some with women he had promised to marry, just as he promised you. You were not a homewrecker, Miss Jensen. You were a casualty of his depravity." Tears were streaming down Catherine's face now. "I came here to apologize. I came to tell you that I was wrong to treat you the way I did, wrong to turn all of Denver against you. I was angry and hurt, and I took it out on you when you were just as much a victim as I was. Can you ever forgive me?" Grace stood frozen, processing this unexpected apology. For years, she had carried the weight of Catherine Whitley's condemnation, the shame of being labeled a homewrecker and a scarlet woman. And now, here was the woman herself, asking for forgiveness. "I do forgive you," Grace heard herself saying. "I understand why you did what you did, and I am sorry for the pain you suffered because of Marcus's actions. No one deserves to be betrayed the way we both were." Catherine wiped at her tears. "Thank you. You are more gracious than I deserve. My sister tells me that you have built a good life here despite everything. I am glad. You deserve happiness." They talked for a while longer, two women bound together by the actions of a man who had hurt them both. When Catherine finally left, Grace sat in her empty shop and cried, releasing years of accumulated pain and anger and shame. But these were healing tears, tears that washed away the last remnants of the past and left her feeling cleansed. That evening, she told Yates about Catherine's visit. He held her close, listening as she recounted the conversation and the apology she had never expected to receive. "How do you feel?" he asked when she finished. "Free," Grace said simply. "For the first time since this whole thing happened, I feel completely free of it. Catherine's condemnation was the weight I could never quite shake, and now she has lifted it. I feel like I can finally close that chapter of my life completely." "You have already built a whole new book," Yates said, kissing her forehead. "But I am glad you have that closure. You deserve it." Life continued its peaceful rhythm. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working on the ranch with his father, already showing signs of the leadership qualities that would serve him well in the future. Catherine, now called Kathy by everyone in the family, was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, always into something and keeping her parents constantly vigilant. In 1893, Grace gave birth to their third child, another boy they named William Yates Donovan. William was a calm, easy baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world around him with solemn eyes. The Donovan family became pillars of the Palisade community. Yates served on the town council, helping to make decisions about schools and infrastructure. Grace's dress shop was one of the most successful businesses in town, and she had gained a reputation for fair dealing and excellent craftsmanship that extended well beyond Palisade. Even Mrs. Henderson eventually came around, though it took until 1895 for her to actually enter Grace's shop and commission a dress. The two women would never be friends, but they achieved a state of mutual respect that was perhaps the best outcome that could be hoped for. Sarah Mitchell remained one of Grace's closest friends, and their families spent many evenings together, the children playing while the adults talked about everything from politics to the price of cattle. Sarah's husband, John, had become one of Yates's partners in the ranch, and their friendship strengthened the business partnership. In 1897, on their 15th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Grace with a trip to Denver. It was her first time back since she had left in disgrace all those years ago, and she was nervous about returning. But Yates held her hand as they walked through the streets, and Grace was amazed to discover that no one recognized her. No one pointed or whispered. The city had moved on, found new scandals to obsess over, forgotten the story of Grace Jensen and Marcus Whitley. They attended the theater, stayed in a fine hotel, and spent 3 days enjoying the amenities of the city. But Grace found herself eager to return to Palisade, to their home in the valley, to their children and the life they had built. Denver held nothing for her anymore. Her home was with Yates. As they stood on the train platform waiting for the journey back to Colorado, Grace reflected on how far she had come. From a broken, shamed woman who thought her life was over to a respected businesswoman, beloved wife, and devoted mother. The journey had been difficult, marked by pain and rejection and struggle. But it had also been marked by love, by Yates's unwavering support and belief in her worth, by the kindness of people like the Daniels and Sarah Mitchell and Mr. Chen, who had looked past the scandal to see the person underneath. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "How grateful I am," Grace said. "For you, for our life together, for the chance to start over and build something beautiful out of the ashes of my past." Yates pulled her close. "You did not just survive, Grace. You triumphed. You took every bit of adversity thrown at you and turned it into strength. I am in awe of you, and I fall more in love with you every single day." The train whistle blew, announcing their departure. As they boarded and settled into their seats, Grace looked out the window at Denver receding into the distance. That city, with all its painful memories, was part of her story but no longer defined it. Her story was being written in Palisade, in the valley where their house stood, in the faces of their children, and the life they shared. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. Thomas graduated from the school in Palisade at the top of his class and chose to work full-time on the ranch, learning the business from his father. Kathy, as bright and energetic as ever, developed a talent for drawing and painting, filling the house with her colorful creations. William, the quiet observer, surprised everyone by revealing a gift for mathematics and an interest in engineering. In 1902, tragedy struck when Margaret Daniels passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78. The whole community mourned the loss of this kind woman who had shown Grace acceptance when so many others had turned her away. At the funeral, Grace spoke about Margaret's generosity of spirit, her ability to see the good in people, and the profound impact she had on the Donovan family. The years turned into decades. Grace and Yates grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. Their children grew into adults, making their own way in the world but always remaining close to the family. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring valley in 1904, and they gave Grace and Yates their first grandchildren, twin boys born in 1905. Kathy moved to Denver to study art, but she came home for summers and holidays, eventually meeting and marrying a journalist who appreciated her creative spirit. William attended college in Boulder, studying engineering, and returned to Palisade to work on bringing electricity and modern conveniences to the rural community. Through it all, Grace and Yates remained devoted to each other. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands and talking about their day, their children, their grandchildren, their dreams for the future. One evening in the summer of 1910, as they sat in their customary spot, Grace reflected on the 28 years since their wedding. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Yates. "Marrying me, taking on all the trouble and gossip that came with it." Yates looked at her in surprise. "Not for one single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace. You and our children and the life we have built together. Marrying you was the smartest decision I ever made." "I was so broken when we met," Grace said softly. "So convinced that my life was ruined, that I would never be worthy of love or respect again." "You were never broken," Yates corrected gently. "You were wounded, but there is a difference. And even at your lowest point there was a strength in you, a dignity that shone through all the pain." That is what I saw when I first met you in that mercantile. Not the scandal, not the gossip, but the remarkable woman underneath it all. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. You saved me, you know, not just from loneliness or social isolation, but from myself. You showed me that I was still worthy of love, still deserving of happiness. You gave me back my life. We saved each other, Yates said. I was adrift before I met you, going through the motions of living but not really alive. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something lasting and meaningful. We made each other whole. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their grandchildren playing, visiting for the summer. The air smelled of pine and sage, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. I would not change a single thing, Grace said. Even the painful parts, even the scandal and the shame and the rejection. All of it led me here to you, to this life. And I would go through it all again if it meant ending up exactly where I am right now. Yates kissed her temple. That is the beauty of redemption. Not that the past is erased, but that it is transformed into something that makes the present even more precious. They grew old together with grace and gratitude. Yates retired from active ranch management in 1915, turning over the day-to-day operations to Thomas while still serving as an advisor. Grace sold her dress shop to Emma, her longtime employee, but continued to sew for pleasure, making quilts for each of her grandchildren. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1922 with a large party attended by what seemed like half the county. People came from miles around to honor the couple who had become legendary in the community for their enduring love, and the way they had overcome adversity to build something beautiful. Mrs. Henderson, now ancient and softened by age, actually approached Grace at the party and said, I was wrong about you. I should have seen what Yates saw all those years ago. You are a good woman and you have been a blessing to this community. I apologize for the cruelty I showed you. Grace, moved by this long-delayed apology, embraced the old woman. We were all younger then and quicker to judge. Thank you for saying this. It means more than you know. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Grace and Yates found themselves alone once again on their porch, the familiar mountains rising around them in the gathering dusk. 40 years, Grace marveled. It seems like both a lifetime and no time at all. The best 40 years of my life, Yates said. And if I am blessed with 40 more, I would spend every one of them with you. They both knew that 40 more years was unlikely. They were in their 60s now, still healthy but feeling the weight of age in their bones. But the thought did not sadden them. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and built a legacy that would endure through their children and grandchildren. In 1925, Yates suffered a heart attack while working in the stable. He survived, but it left him weakened, a reminder that their time together was finite. Grace devoted herself to caring for him, and he joked that he had always suspected she just wanted to boss him around. I have been wanting to boss you around for 43 years, Grace retorted with a smile. But you were always too stubborn to listen. I listened when it mattered, Yates said, taking her hand. Like when you told me you loved me or when you said you would marry me, I listened to all the important things. They had 3 more good years together. Years of watching their grandchildren grow, of quiet evenings on the porch, of holding hands and remembering all the moments, both big and small, that had made up their life together. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold January night in 1928. He was 70 years old, and Grace was holding his hand when he took his last breath. The pain of losing him was profound, a wound that went soul deep, but Grace did not regret a single moment of their time together. At the funeral, attended by hundreds of people from all over the region, Grace stood beside the casket and spoke about the man she had loved for more than half her life. "Yates Donovan was a good man," she said, her voice steady despite her grief. "He was kind when the world was cruel, compassionate when others were judging, brave when it would have been easier to walk away. He saw past the surface to the person underneath, and in doing so, he changed my life completely. He taught me that redemption is possible, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, that the past does not have to define the future. I am grateful beyond measure for every day I had with him." After Yates's death, Grace moved into a smaller house in Palisade, closer to Kathy, who had returned to Colorado with her husband and children. Thomas ran the ranch now with his sons, carrying on the legacy his father had built. William had become a successful engineer, working on dam projects throughout the West, but always coming home for holidays and family gatherings. Grace lived for another 12 years after Yates passed, years filled with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She continued to sew, to read, to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. But a part of her was always waiting, always ready to be reunited with the man who had loved her when the world said she was unlovable. She passed away quietly in her sleep in the spring of 1940, at the age of 81. Her last words, spoken to Kathy, who was sitting beside her bed, were, "Tell your father I am coming home to him." At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives Grace had touched in some way. Her children and grandchildren spoke about her strength, her kindness, her wisdom. They talked about how she had overcome adversity to build a life of purpose and meaning, how she had never let the judgment of others diminish her worth, how she had loved fiercely and completely. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source. Emma, now an old woman herself, stood up and told the story of how Grace had given her a job when no one else would hire her. How she had taught her not just the skills of sewing but the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than stories. "Grace Jensen Donovan taught me that everyone deserves a second chance," Emma said. "That our mistakes do not have to define us, and that compassion and understanding can transform lives." She was labeled damaged goods by people who should have known better, but one man looked past the lies and the gossip to see the truth. And together, they built something beautiful that touched all of our lives. Grace and Yates were buried side by side in the Palisade Cemetery, on a hill overlooking the valley where they had made their home. Their headstone bore a simple inscription that said everything that needed to be said. Grace Jensen Donovan, 1858 to 1940, and Yates Donovan, 1858 to 1928. They loved each other past all reason and redemption. The years passed, and the town of Palisade changed with the times. The old mining operations closed down, replaced by fruit orchards and vineyards. The Wild West gave way to the modern world, with paved roads and automobiles replacing dusty trails and horses. But the story of Grace and Yates endured, passed down through generations as a reminder that love can triumph over judgment, that redemption is always possible, and that the courage to start over can lead to the most beautiful endings. Their descendants continued to thrive in the valley. The ranch Thomas ran became one of the most successful in western Colorado, passed down through the Donovan family for generations. Kathy's artistic legacy lived on through her children and grandchildren, several of whom became successful artists and writers. William's engineering work helped modernize rural Colorado, bringing electricity and modern conveniences to communities that had long been isolated. But more than their material legacy, Grace and Yates left behind a testament to the power of seeing people for who they truly are rather than what others say about them. Their love story became legendary in Palisade, a reminder that everyone deserves compassion and that the past does not have to dictate the future. In the end, Grace Jensen, the woman who had been considered damaged goods by all, found a cowboy who looked past her history and loved her anyway. And together, they built a love that lasted beyond their lifetimes, a legacy of hope and redemption that would inspire generations to come. Their story proved that sometimes the most beautiful chapters are written after everything seems lost, and that true love sees not the scandal or the mistakes, but the heart of the person underneath. They had faced judgment and overcome it, endured hardship and emerged stronger, built a life from the ashes of disgrace that became more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. And in doing so, they wrote a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered long after the wild days of the Colorado frontier had faded into history.